what was your favorite age?
Ooh. Probably last year because this wasn't happening. But last year was I turned 30 earlier this year. So that whole past year was really nice. Just, I don't know, leaving the 20s, I thought I'd be maybe a little more sad about that, but it was kind of a nice welcome to the next decade. I had a really good time and I feel like surrounded by really good people. So it was a good age for me, I feel.
I like that. That's amazing. And what would we find on your nightstand?
My glasses, for sure. A book usually, or actually a pile of books that I haven't read, but at least one book that I am reading. Oh, and then I have this, besides a lamp, like I have this eye pillow that I got like while doing yoga. So it's like a little bit weighted. And if I ever really need to relax, just laying there with an eye pillow for 10 minutes is super soothing. So definitely recommend an eye pillow if you ever find one.
Yeah, I've heard about like weighted blankets because I'm a
Yeah.
napper. I'm the queen of
Yeah.
napping, and apparently weighted blankets are really good for like
Yeah.
quickly kind of calming the body down.
Yeah, I think something about this area with like near your temples, like having just a little bit of weight right there, just really is so soothing.
Ah, and give us a snapshot of an everyday joy.
Mm. Oh, that's easy. I have a 2.5-year-old, and when she wants to give me a kiss is really sweet. I love that. So little tiny little toddler kisses are really that's an everyday joy for sure.
That's beautiful. You are definitely human.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Danielle. I'm going to hand over to you.
Okay. So hi everyone. I'm Danielle. So I guess I plan to chat for like about 20 minutes, but I wanted to kind of start like with my background and then go into some things I learned during like last year I was looking for a job and I was looking to like leave events and go into project management, but here I am and I'm still in events. So I'll kind of take you through that journey and I'll talk a little bit about like everything I learned about project management while studying for the PMP test, which is the project management professional test, as well as what I learned with changing my resume 100 times last year, as well as interviewing, because there were interviews, lots of interviews, and it's hard to talk about our event experience in a project management way when all the skills are the same, but the projects themselves are a little different. So that's kind of my plan. Um, and thankfully now, although I'm still in events, my current employer, we do events, but they rely heavily on project management methodologies and processes, and that's something I didn't have in my past event management roles, and I'm very glad to have them now. So I'll kind of throw that in how I use project management nowadays too. So my background, I started from the beginning, my education is in events. So I went to, I have a bachelor's in event management, and it was at a college specifically geared towards hospitality majors. So there was food and beverage, there was theme park management, there was like hotel and lodging management, and I took the event management route. And this was a whole campus dedicated to all hospitality majors at a major university. So we have a whole separate campus for us, but it was in a city that relies heavily on tourism. So it made sense that they kind of raise the next generation of people that would be supporting the tourists in that city. So that's where I started. And then I went to work at a couple of venues, and I did that for probably most of my career. And those venues, those kind of events we did were 300 people on average and up to like a few thousand people on like a higher, larger size event. And now I work on tech conferences, so more of the planner side. And these tech conferences are, typically between 20,000 and 30,000 attendees, which is obviously something we can't do right now. It's so we've pivoted to virtual events, which is very different than what we are used to doing and used to planning. But last year, when I was thinking of making a change from the venue life, the event life, I think I was really kind of over the late nights, and with the venue side, I was doing like one event a week probably, which in the end of the year is like 50 events. And it was a lot of late nights. And I wanted to kind of get away from that and use my skills in just a different way. Because I still liked what I did. It was after 8 years, it was just getting to be a little bit much. And so that's when I started exploring project management. And I'll talk a little bit about the project management roles that I interviewed for and all that, and what I've learned about the different industries that use project management, because it expands across so many different industries and not just events. But thankfully now I'm getting to still use my skills as an event manager with project management focus, as well as I'm doing like 3 events a year rather than 50. So that's much nicer, and it's nicer to focus and work on these larger events. And kind of the first step for me when I was applying for project management jobs, when all of my titles pretty much said event manager for past jobs, I was studying for the PMP. And on my resume, that was the first thing I did, is I called that out. I called out PMP in process, so that they knew I did not test, and they knew that I did not have an actual certification, but that I was in process. So I was learning all the skills, and I started with reading the PMBOK guide, which is something from the Project Management Institute. It's super dry. I wouldn't recommend it for fun, but it was super helpful. And there's other ways you can kind of learn the same material. So there was that. And then I think I also picked up a PMP study book by Rita. That was one that was really recommended. I bought an older copy. So like, if that's something you just want to upskill, you don't want to spend hundreds of dollars, you could always buy an earlier edition like I did, and it's still the same information, well, relatively the same information, and still useful, very useful. And I did the 35-hour training that's required in order to test. And that takes pretty much everything that's in the PMBOK guide and breaks it down. And it broke it down in a much easier way to understand. So that was probably my favorite part. When it came to the test, I never tested. I did not want to study in a way that was just memorizing formulas. And part of the test is memorization of formulas and executing those equations. And I live in Excel spreadsheets in my day job. So I didn't find it necessary to just memorize formulas for the sake of it. The most valuable part of that whole process for me was learning and being able to apply everything I learned to my job, whether as an event manager or project manager. So that's kind of what happened last year. So kind of some of the things I wanted to highlight is like making the connection between project management, like the life cycle of a project and how it's the same as the life cycle as an event, as well as like the different knowledge areas that like project management and the PMP certification kind of require you to learn, is how we can also view events in the same way, and as well as like other project industries. So the life cycle of a project being the same as an event, there's the initiating process. So initiating, there's the planning process, executing, controlling and monitoring, and then closing. So we initiate a project and an event. So if you initiate an event, that could be very well the sales process. Initiating a project, there's usually a kickoff to start, and then you get to the planning process, which makes sense. That's, I think, for planners, event managers, where we live a lot. We live in that planning process. And then, of course, you move on to executing. So when you're executing the event, usually you're on site and the event's begun. For projects, the execution could be almost as long as the planning process itself, because if you're executing a software, say, it's not something that's one night like an event could be. It's something that could take months. After executing, there's the monitoring and controlling process. Well, it's not necessarily after, it's kind of at the same time. So monitoring and controlling an event, you want to, when you're during an event, you'll see that, the salad course is almost done. So you want to make sure that the entrees are plated and that there's servers in the alleyways waiting to come and bring and plate the entree to bring it to everybody. Same for an event, same for a project, making sure that the next step is ready to go once your project specific task has been completed, so that you can make the next step, and controlling if there's any changes that need to be made as you're monitoring. For events, there's so many things that the client might have specified, and if you arrive on site and it's not that way, then a change request has to be made. Same for a project, that during that monitoring and controlling, if there's something that needed to be changed for quality control, you don't wait until the project's complete to make that change. You do it before like the event gets kicked off or the project gets started. And then of course, closing a project or closing an event. I feel like in a lot of my past event jobs, this closing an event thing wasn't really thought of very much. But it's just a way to maybe even just wrap up finances or close out invoices. And it's the same with the project. Some of that paperwork stuff can just come with the closing of a project. But for events, just framing it, thinking of the same life cycle as a project and how we move through each life cycle when it comes to thinking of projects or interviewing for a project management job, being able to frame it that way when we are asked certain questions of how we've handled things in the past. And making the connection between projects and events in a different way, more general way. Pretty much an event, like the goal, right, is to execute it on time and on budget and to stakeholder or client or investor expectations, right? So for projects, there might be an investor and all of the stakeholders involved. The project has to be to their expectations, among other things, for like on time and on budget. So there's very much a parallel there between events and projects. So when thinking about all of the ways that you make sure things are on time and the ways you make sure things are on budget, it's the same skills that you would use when making sure a project is on time or on budget. There's also the aspect of backwards planning, and of course the aspect of communicating with a team and managing that team to achieve objectives and meet deadlines, because that's a huge part of projects and events, is those deadlines. And so in some projects, they call them milestones. And so for events, we all know that there could be catering or like food and beverage orders have to be in 2 weeks prior to an event, and maybe you can make changes to that quantity up to 3 days before. Even things for events like signage or decor or even paper programs, those need to be ordered in advance in order to maybe get a discounted rate or meet shipping deadlines. And so these deadlines within events can definitely be applied and translated to projects. Keeping track of signage and decor, instead of signage and decor kind of deadlines, some projects require bulk ordering supplies. And so thinking of how you track those deadlines and events is the same way you would be able to manage milestones and meeting some deadlines in projects. And even thinking about how we backwards plan, that's how I usually think of an event. We know the event date and we just backwards plan how long every task is going to take us for each event task, right? And same for a project. So there's the deadline or the due date that a project must be complete or that an event is going to take place, and it must be fully planned prior to that. And so right now, I know I have a virtual event October 13th, and I've got 40 sessions that I need to have produced prior to that. And if my production team is telling me that they can do 10 sessions a week, then I need at least 4 weeks, right? But I also want some buffer time because I need to upload them. I need to create links for them. So I would need at least 5 weeks to just do the sessions for this virtual event. So backwards planning that way for an event would be the same for any project, knowing who's on your team, how much time they need for each task, and backwards planning it from there. And for something like I interviewed for a lot of jobs with creative advertising or marketing agencies last year as a project manager. And one thing that their team kind of looks a little different than event teams. There's no caterer, there's no AV vendor, but their team could be primarily of the writing team or the design team, and kind of working with them, knowing that those two teams are working on other projects, but for your project as a project manager, you would find out how long the design team needs to create, the illustration that you need for a particular client's marketing campaign that's coming up. But you would also have to have the editing team or the writing team work on copy that would go onto that illustration. So knowing how long each team needs and kind of backwards planning in order to meet the deliverable and give it to the client on time. And then of course on budget, because if you're suddenly rushing any of your staff and you need to pay overtime, that's suddenly not on budget. So thinking of events the same way that we think of projects, it's very much all the same skills. The other thing would be knowledge areas. And this was a part of when I was studying for the PMP that I felt was I saw the connections easily, where the overlap between the knowledge areas and the skills that project managers and event managers have. So I'll kind of run through them and then I'll go through them little each one. So there's scope management, schedule management, cost management, quality management, resource management, communication management, risk management, procurement, and stakeholder management. So all of those can just sound like very vague terms, but if you break it down, so scope management, right? That's the planning process. That's determining the scale of each event or project. And for some events, if I'm thinking of an event and the scale or the scope, if it's an award ceremony, do I want to have a big bash where there's going to be a ton of AV and a light show, and then we're gonna have a band open after the awards? Or is it gonna be something more scaled down, lower, kind of low key, and just a dinner and just awards given out and a couple of speeches, no AV needed? So that's like the scope of an event. And very much for the projects, the scope works in the same way. Like, what is the client's budget? What can their particular project afford because of their budget? Or if there's some things that are not tied to costs, like how big is this project going to be? How long is it going to take? That's the scope. And then the schedule management, that's more of like, for events, I've always kind of used like production schedules. But for projects, my current role, we use project timelines a lot more because so much goes into the planning, and that project timeline and which staff member or team member on the project is doing what task, and at what point in the timeline do we have to start that task. Whereas production schedules and events tend to be more on site, but so much for projects, like the same way we think of that schedule for events, we can apply it to projects. And then of course, cost management. I think for event managers, we are very familiar with RFPs, or requests for proposals, and that process, that cost, like that researching the cost process. And for projects, it's the same thing, like researching different resources and what the budget's going to be and how to fit, like different costs fit into the budget. So it's just, different costs and different suppliers, different vendors, but very much the same skills that we're using to cost manage in events are how we would cost manage in general projects. Quality management, that kind of goes back to the monitoring and controlling. So if there's something that shows up for the project that is not to the client's or stakeholders' expectations, it's a matter of changing it in order to make sure that it meets expectations, whether that's an event or a project. And then resource management. I think events don't typically happen with just one person. It's a huge collaborative effort typically. And so managing your resources, managing your team, it could be for events, managing your caterer, managing your AV vendor, managing your reg team, managing your coat check staff here up in Chicago. There's a lot of different team members that we have to manage. And for a project, it's the same thing. It's like going back to the advertising or marketing agencies, working and managing the time of the editing team or the time of the design team, and managing them as resources. And then the next would be communication management. This, I found that my past event management experiences kind of set aside and didn't pay much mind to, but I think as event managers, we'd all say that we're probably really good at communication, or that's a skill that is really important in our industry. And it's just as well in project management. And I'm glad that it's its own like knowledge area, because within past roles, there would be things that would be like status updates or gaining approval. And we would come up with something new that we were doing in past roles. And my leadership would kind of be like, oh, just email people, just let them know via email. But nowadays in my current role, it's more strategic. So sometimes the delivery and the way we communicate with stakeholders is just as important about the strategy and how we talked about making a change. The way we communicated that change is almost just as important. So I'm happy that projects don't kind of skip over that, because it is an important part for event managers and for project managers. There's risk management as well. And that one, I think, is huge in events. And I think we all know, like if you're in an outdoor venue, that you would definitely want to have a rain plan. And if for safety and security risks, if there's going to be a protest the day of your event, you would definitely want to make a backup plan or a plan B route to make sure your guests are getting to your event. And similar, the way we would manage that kind of situation is how we would manage a project. I think for certain projects, if there's shipping, that you need to make sure some supplies that you're ordering come in time, and you can't start the next task until you have those items. Your risk part, the risk management that you do would be to anticipate that, oh, there's this time of year, there's shipping delays because of the holidays or something, and planning extra time, buffer time in your project timeline for shipping delays. And part of your risk is giving yourself an extra week or two, and that's part of your risk management plan. And so it's very much like how we do it for our events. We have those skills. We can very much do it for more general projects across other industries. Procurement management is very, I think it's very easy, like purchasing vendor services or purchasing supplies. If it's a construction site, and if you're a project manager for a construction site, you very easily could, at one point, it's time to order furniture, right? Or fixtures. When it's time to order fixtures, that's procurement, just purchasing different services or products. Lastly, stakeholder management, and it's just important players. It's important to know the players, and for events, there's clients, there's planners, there's the vendors, but there's also guests. Guests are a stakeholder for your event, and very much for the project. Like the investors, there's tons, usually investors that are involved in projects, and not just the staff or the higher level decision makers. But even instead of guests for projects, it would be like the recipient of a project. So you can think of like a video game developer. If someone's developing a video game, the players in the end, those will be their stakeholders too. And so decisions that are made along the way, of course, is kept with them in mind when you're managing that project, because you want to make sure it sells to them. So even software, if you're developing software as a project manager, thinking of who's the recipient of that software and any of the stakeholders involved along the way. Sure, the people with the money do make a lot of the decisions, but other stakeholders are important to factor in as well. So I appreciate that being a knowledge area, just as a check, just reevaluating who's important, who needs to be communicated with, and who do I need to keep in mind to make sure that this project is successful. So I think that's a lot, but I think that's a good background knowledge to have as I then went into like last year, editing my resume a ton and seeing what stuck, what got me calls or what got me emails at least, and then interviewing as well, because I think the biggest part or challenge I had was talking about all of this and how they would ask situational questions and how I would answer, because I worked on events and they were asking questions about a different kind of project, but it was all the same skills. So the resume edits, pretty much, so before we talk about interviews, we'll start with the resume. I wanted my resume to look more like a project manager's resume, but I didn't want to like downplay the fact that my expertise was events, and that's why my title had always been event manager. But I started to think about, I added the PMP and process line, but I then thought about each event being its own project. And so where it made sense on my resume, I swapped out the word event and I made it say project. As long as it made sense and as long as it fit, I made that change just so that a recruiter or someone that was doing the hiring could see that and see that I was thinking about my events in a project way. I also changed my kind of the summary, the first part. We typically have like a headline or an overview section on resumes here, and on that, like a couple bullets, like the highlights of my experience, I changed that header section to event manager - project management expertise. So it's calling it out from the beginning. I'm an event manager, but my expertise is project management. I come at it from a project management perspective. I wanted them to know from the beginning. And I found when I did that, I definitely got more attention, because you very well probably are worried that your resume, if it says that your experience is mostly in events, that it's just going to get tossed. But we want to stand out in an industry of people that are also applying for jobs that are also project managers, and they've got that on their resume already. But the other kind of things I changed with the language of my resume was grouping aspects of each role by those overlapping knowledge areas. So I have one written down here. So for like one of my roles, I had risk management, and it was ensure compliance with safety and security requirements, anticipate risks, and develop plans of actions. And I was talking about an event. I was talking about an event where I had to make sure I was compliant with safety and security requirements of that city, and I had to anticipate risk, and I had to develop a plan of action. But that very well could be any project. That could be software, that could be construction. It's general enough for them to know that I have the capabilities and the skills, no matter what kind of project it is. As well as communication management, kind of talking about how that's huge in our industry. So I had like grouped it by knowledge area. So communication management, including task management, stakeholder expectations, status reports, as well as directed internal client and vendor meetings. Those are all things I did for events, but general enough to show that the skills and the leadership that I had handling that kind of skill for events, I can bring to projects. Stakeholder management, constant and evolving vigilance on the relationship between internal teams, national client base, our vendors, our sponsors, and the venue. So even that, managing those relationships and how you want to make sure everyone plays well together, that's not easy to do sometimes. And the way we do it for events is very similar to the way you would do it in a project. It's just different people, different stakeholders, but the skills are still there. So those are just kind of like a couple of examples. If you guys wanted to have my resume just as a reference, I'm happy to share it. I'm no resume pro, but I know sometimes it's just helpful to have like an example to reference with this language that, just trying to frame our event skills in a more general way. So then the interviews started coming. It's great. I got emails, I got phone calls, many phone interviews, multiple in-person interviews. But the challenge I was faced with was those situational questions during the interviews and talking about my experience with this language and applying it to different industries, because I wasn't just, there was marketing and advertising, but there was software. So there was very much a range of industries that I was interviewing for. And so those kind of the couple things that kind of came up, like a couple examples, us event managers are familiar with the RFP process, the request for proposal, researching vendors to decide who to work with before you sign any contracts. And so that RFP process in project management is it's just managing resources. And so being able to talk about how I manage resources in events and the researching of the different vendors and suppliers, that's like the scoping process. Being able to talk about scoping out a project or event and how I worked it's just kind of sometimes easier to just break it down in a more general sense so that I could talk about the skills that I have when it comes to those situational questions that they were asking. And even things like budgets, right? We're going back to budgets and cost management, how important that is. Being able to discuss how I was able to reduce costs for my events or projects by having a great understanding of what my vendors and suppliers did and the work that they did. I was able to increase profit for each event, or in this case, each project as I was talking about it. So, companies love to hear how you reduce costs or how you increase profit. So being able to talk about the skills you have just framed in a more general or more with language that is project management based. Another thing I think we touched on a little bit was those project or production schedules, and that's what we used a lot in my past event management roles. But for project managers, we rely closely on project timelines because it's such a larger scale rather than just focusing on the on-site and execution. It's the whole plan and everything that needs to happen in one place. So in my current role in tech conferences, we definitely use both project timelines and on-site timelines, but just knowing and thinking about the kind of tools or documents or spreadsheets that I use as an event manager, I started to think about how each of them would be translated to project managers. So sometimes some general questions that came up as on project management interviews was, how do I keep organized? And there's a million different ways you can answer that question, but the best way is to be able to take something you use for your events and to put them in a more general term. And knowing a term like project timeline is something that's within the project management community. It's just sometimes that's super helpful to be able to frame it that way. So that's most of what I've got. I hope it wasn't too much. I hope it made sense and was helpful. If if you want to connect with me on LinkedIn, please do. You can ask me for my resume. I've got notes that I kind of like had little highlights that I wanted to make sure I hit. I can send you today's points if you want that. I hope to just help you use the language. One more tip. When I was thinking about like the studying for the PMP, if you have LinkedIn Premium, or if you're willing to invest in like 1 month of it to gain access to LinkedIn Learning, one of my favorite courses was that PMP prep course on LinkedIn Learning. And it's called Cert Prep Project Management Professional, and then it's PMP in parentheses, and it's by Sandra Mitchell. And I have to say, it's long because it's that 35-hour required training. It's long, but compared to another 35-hour training that I paid hundreds of dollars for, I prefer Sandra's process and how she shared and kind of described the information and applied it to real world. So personally, I found it more cost effective and I enjoyed it more. And thinking about cost, I mean, that's just cost management right there, which is what we're all trying to do, right? So yeah, I hope this helps and wasn't too overwhelming. And I'm happy to stay on, chat, ask me questions, or I'll try to answer as best I can.
Hello. Hi. Yes. So thank you very much for explaining with your lingo all
Yeah.
the things that we already know, but sometimes we
Mhm.
tend to forget.
Mhm.
My question is, so I am an events manager. I've always
Mhm.
worked I worked in venues like you did, and I also worked for asset management companies. And so I was thinking transitioning to project management. The only thing is, I don't know if that was the case for you, but my question is, when I think about that, I just don't know where, because I feel that events, I knew that there is asset management, there is venues, there is music industry. I mean, I
Yeah.
feel that I know the industries, but when it comes to project management, I'm lost.
Yeah.
So, what was it like for you? I feel like there's like I don't know, it's almost like I have to jump in the unknown.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think that scares me. And I think that's what is um, preventing me from taking the jump. I don't know how to phrase it, but basically,
It makes sense.
the industry.
Yeah. I found because almost every industry uses project managers in some way, and sometimes they call them something different. So even looking for job searchings that popped up was tricky because some industries, like I know the video game developer community, they call their project managers producers. And producer is like it's like a movie term to me. Like, I don't know, like I can't be a movie producer, but that's what they call them. So, I mean, I've seen jobs for video game developer project managers, and it was a producer role or assistant producer role. But when you read through it, all of the tasks, like task management, keeping people on time, and managing a large team of video game developers, whether that's the artist, the engineer, the animator, managing all of their time along the way and making sure you hit milestones and hit the deadline and produce a video game in the end, their producers are effectively project managers. There were definitely other industries I saw, like the construction industry. I saw a few project manager roles for that, but I was always hesitant to apply for them because I didn't really know much about that industry. Whereas a marketing and advertising agencies, I applied for those a lot. And I think it was I got a lot of calls for those too, because a few hiring managers told me they saw my resume and they picked me to interview because they saw I had event experience. And what some of their clients have started wanting to incorporate like experiential activations. So in their marketing campaigns, they wanted to do some experiential marketing, which in effect are events, which is what we do. So being a project manager and applying and interviewing for some of those jobs in the marketing industry, there is a little bit of an overlap. There's tricky with those kind of jobs as a marketing manager because there's a little bit of overlap with events, but there's also the focus on data and analytics, and that's not my forte. But there's some marketing jobs that are a little bit more project management based, like these digital ad agencies. that need someone to keep the team on task and need someone to plan these different marketing campaigns for their clients, and sometimes even want someone with an events background in order to execute those like experiences that kind of became trendy this past year. I will say I saw a ton of project management roles for the software industry, software as a service, but it's tricky there because some of those project management roles, they need you to be a little bit more technical. They need you to be more of an engineer. They need you to be more of, to have the actual technical abilities. But that's obviously not what I was trying to do. I was trying to just manage the team, do the kickoff calls like we normally do for events, like doing our initial vendor meetings and our final walkthroughs. Those kind of meetings happen in projects as well, even if it's a software that you're producing rather than an event. So those I saw a lot of, and I'm sure there's other industries that I'm not super familiar with that need project managers too. Does that kind of help frame like where you could look?
Yeah. I feel that what is, I think, detrimental in everything you said is changing the word. Looking for other word than just events. So like, could be producers, it could be project managers, it could be marketing managers. But I think reading the job descriptions, will help and figure out what is the job actually, because like you said, sometimes they say marketing manager and you're thinking, oh, I have to create a campaign, but actually no, you probably end up doing more project management stuff than you'd think of. So it's a bit tricky I think it's going to be tricky to kind of navigate between all those. I hope there will be a lot. Jobs description, but yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much. That helped.
Of course. Yeah. Hey. Oh, Vivian, you're muted. There you go.
Hi. Thanks for your for sharing all the advice, because it's really useful. And I've been I'm studying for the PMP at the moment, so
you are.
Yeah, I have the book here.
Is it overwhelming for you? Because I felt like it was overwhelming at first.
Yeah, it took me a long time to really understand the logic behind it. But yeah. I have a question for you. Do you have any, as you've done interviews? I've never done interviews, or I've done a couple of job applications, but they didn't really go through for project management jobs. So you shared lots of advice on what to do. Do you have any advice on what not to do, what not to talk about, or?
Ooh, that's a good one. That's a good question. I don't know if I have something not to do. I guess I would say I've had experience in weddings, and I refuse to frame any of my experience with those weddings. So earlier on in my career, at the first venue I worked at, we did quite a few weddings. And some of those clients, I had a really great relationship with, and I had really successful events with them. But when it came to interviewing for project management, I did not want to bring up the fact that some of my experience was in weddings. I wanted to make it more corporate. And it's just, it's just a different type of relationship with your client at wedding versus a corporate event. So I preferred not to bring that up because I didn't want to get pigeonholed into, oh, you're just like a social event planner. You're just, you don't really, how can you plan parties and then come in and manage my $1 million project? So I didn't, that's something, if you have some, maybe if it's not weddings for you, maybe if it's something that you feel is more social and they might pigeonhole you because they don't see how it's related, but frame it differently, because weddings are still events. And so I was able to talk about them in an event way. Like, this past event I worked on, this is how I blah, blah, blah. So maybe that would be my only advice, is something not to do. And not that I ever said, oh, I had this wedding and it didn't work out for me. I definitely avoided it. I didn't want to call it out.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions there?
Oh, sorry.
Go for it.
Yeah.
Regarding the studies you took, the PMP, would you say that was detrimental in getting a job as a project manager, or could you have done it without having this degree?
Well, the fact I don't have it.
Oh, because you didn't take the test.
I didn't take the test.
Right.
No. So what I did I put on my resume while I was studying and while I was doing the training. I put on my resume that it was in process, and now I just took it off because I'm no longer studying and I'm not going to take the test. So I took it off my resume. But it was definitely helpful, I think, to have it, to call it out while I was applying for project management jobs, so that they knew that I was serious about it and not just like throwing my resume in a pile for them to discard. It definitely doesn't hurt. I think I gained so much more from the process of studying and learning the language and learning how I could apply. Like when I would learn something from studying, I would think, how would I use that in an event? How would I use that in a video game? How would I use that in a construction site? And I just tried to apply it in so many different ways, just to like mentally build my own skills and of course prep for those interviews when a question might come up. So the learning that I gained from it and pretty much upskilling, that was more valuable to me than having the letters attached to my name. But it's a really hard test to take. So anybody that does pass, it's like kudos, because it's really tough. So I think it's worthwhile to have those names or have those letters attached to your name, because people in the industry see it and it's definitely street cred, because they know that you've worked hard to not just be a project manager, but to know the methods behind it. For me, I'm just glad to have learned it all and be able to, I just feel better prepared in more higher level meetings now, and being able to kind of talk about it and frame my event experience in a way that is a skill for a lot of industries.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Fab. Okay. Well, we've hit 1 o'clock, so I won't keep you all. Thank you so much, Danielle, for the incredible.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you guys.
And I'll see some of you next